Kevin Gordon here from Autosavant.com, coming to you from the 2013 Audi S7. The S7 is the performance variant of the very stylish A7, the four-door coupe-profiled hatchback that's based off of the A6. To create the S7, and before we actually get to the mechanicals and the underpinning, it's kind of interesting what Audi's doing from a brand perspective. The base A cars are available, of course, with their S-line packaging, which makes them look a little bit more sporty, but doesn't add a lot from an actual performance perspective. The S cars are going to be their step-up line of cars, which are, the same sort of chassis, but with upgrades performance in suspension, transmission, and engine. And then, of course, above that's going to be their RS line, which is their absolute top of the range sort of track-friendly or cars. Of course, their Halo R8 car is the only car they have so far that's named purely from an R perspective. So with the S7, it's interesting because does it compare to, say, an M5? Well, not really, because Audi's starting to split the difference between their S cars and their RS cars. So this car winds up being a definite step up in performance compared to an A7 or an A6 for that matter, but it's not really an all-out, like, rip-roaring, rip the doors off performance car. It really is a nice sort of split in between the two. So to make the S7, the important part is their all-new 4-liter twin-turbo V8, which makes 420 horsepower and 406 foot-pounds of torque. Those are big numbers, but in today's world, they're not enormous numbers. Let's face it, there's so many cars out there that are hitting that 500 foot-pound of torque or 500 horsepower number that really, it might sort of leave you wondering what's going on. Well, a lot of it's in the way that it's being delivered. The smaller displacement 4-liter V8 that's in this car has 2 turbochargers nestled in between the actual bank of the V, so they get very, very compact packaging of the engine. They also get almost zero lag. I mean, I can't imagine they're going to get much closer to making a car with no lag until they build in some kind of anti-lag system. The reason is from the exhaust perspective to the turbocharger. The length on this car is so short, and all the turbochargers are twin scroll units. So there's 2 cylinders that feed one scroll and 2 cylinders that feed the other one per bank. So that happens on both sides of the V8, which makes it so that I think they said it makes 60% of its torque at 1,000 RPM, and I believe by 1,650 RPM it's making 400 foot-pounds of torque. So basically, from the time that you're in the gas all the way up until redline, it's basically a big flat plateau of torque. So this car, I noticed it driving out here this morning, that as you're driving along on the highway, it's got a 7-speed transmission. Well, you leave it in full cruise control and automatic mode, it sits there in 7th gear, even pulling itself up pretty significant grades going along the highway. It at 1,600 RPM in top gear just cranks along with no thought of downshifting. So as I mentioned, the transmission that's in this one is Audi's 7-speed, as they label it, their S-tronic transmission, which is just another term for a dual clutch unit. It's getting to be pretty familiar across Audi's lines, and it really does work quite well. I mean, there's not much more you could ask for in an automated transmission. It's fast when it needs to be. It's smooth when it needs to be. The thing I think is interesting about it is, for it being a 7-speed unit, the low ratios are actually still pretty tall, and I think they're taking advantage of all the torque made by the motor, so that, first, second, and third gear, if you're driving it in a sporty fashion, you're really never going to get above 3rd gear while having any hope of keeping your license. Also new for the S cars from Audi in 2013 is built-in launch control, which we've never used before, haven't read any of the manuals. Honestly, it's literally the first time. We're sitting here on an on-ramp that's about 4 feet long to get onto one of the parkways in New York. We've got it in full manual mode. I turned off traction control, and I noticed that if you leave your left foot on the brake and your right foot on the gas, it will happily rev the engine, which says to me that I found the secret combination for launch control. So we'll see how this works. It clearly works quite well. Audi quotes this car at 4.5 seconds, 0 to 60. I can tell you that's a very, very, very safe estimate. I have to believe that this car is really closer to 4 seconds flat, if not below it. You let the all-wheel drive system work out what's happening underneath you, and it's zero drama to get to super legal speeds very quickly. With the S-Line cars from Audi, you get a couple other interesting features. Of course, you get bigger brakes. This car has air suspension, so the standard A6 and A7, I don't believe, come with it. This one has it, which means as you go through the driving modes that are available in the car, you get dynamic, automatic, comfort. You can set up an individual one as well. In dynamic, it lowers the car an additional centimeter. The S cars are a centimeter lower already than the A cars, so it does sort of hunker it down when you have it in sort of full attack mode. But what I think is more interesting about the S cars built in as standard is a full torque vectoring rear differential. So it's one of those things that a lot of the other manufacturers make you pay for as an option. And, you know, it's good of Audi to do it, but I think there's another reason why it's standard amongst all their cars. When you get into these all-wheel drive sports cars, I'm actually going to turn us back to comfort here for a second as we sort of meander along one of the back roads in upstate New York here. Quiet things down for everybody out there. But as you get into these all-wheel drive performance cars, they're just naturally a little bit more pushy. It's much harder to make an all-wheel drive car as sort of tail happy and neutral from a cornering perspective as you might find in other places. Well, the torque vectoring rear diff that they put in these really does help to neutralize that significantly. This one, you put it into a corner, as soon as you start to apply power, you get that, it's a little unnatural, but because it's something new from a sensations perspective, but there's nothing obtuse about it. You get into a corner, you start to apply power, and the car does work on rotating itself. And that's because that outer rear wheel has the ability to crank up the amount of power that's going to it based on what's going on from, I'm sure 7,000 different sensors. And it does make this a much more neutral car than it would sort of be by default. Other things bespoke for the S-Line cars are the interiors. And there's one really welcome change that I find in the Audi S-Line cars, which is most of the A-level cars, or sort of the base level cars for Audi, regardless of the S-Line or not, come with seats that end in a U. Their stitching is set up so that the front thigh bolster is rounded. These, you get the full straight side bolster as well as an extendable thigh support. It's a manual thigh support down here. And it makes it, for me at least, a much more comfortable place to spend time. I don't know what it is about those U-shaped seats, but I just don't find them as comfortable or ever find myself in quite the right position. Where in this car, you get power seats, of course, power steering wheel, and you can really find a really nice, comfortable place to be.